sideways and not know what I'm talking about. So it's just easier to say I'm American Indian or Native. Okay, so now I want to talk about like understanding, like again, defining terms. The way we talk in American Indian studies, the frameworks that undergird the way that we teach and the way that we understand ourselves has been within the realm of colonial studies or even post-colonial studies. But in that framework of colonial and post-colonial studies, there began to emerge a different way of talking about the experience of colonization of people like American Indian people and First Nations people in Canada, also in Australia, the Indigenous people down there, and New Zealand with the Maori populations. There are places where colonialism happened in a different way than it did in places like Asia and Africa. And the difference is that that the way it unfolded in excuse me, in the so-called New World is that it came with this, you know, while colonialism in other places was basically about extracting resources and exploiting the resources and the people to extract those resources and have those resources. And here I'm talking about everything from timber to gold to other kinds of minerals, you know, and send those things back to benefit the home countries or the other, you know, typically, of course, European. In general, it didn't mean a population transfer, and the indigenous populations remained in the majority, even though they became dominated by a foreign government. So colonialism, and especially this term post-colonialism, referred to those places where indigenous peoples were able to defeat their colonial dominators and send them back, and then gain independence. But in these other places, like in the US and, you know, the New World, Australia, New Zealand, this is a different type of colonialism where Europeans came and the goal was land. It was land acquisition. It wasn't just to exploit the resources, but it was to acquire the lands by any means necessary. And that ultimately means the elimination of the native people. And so this framework really comes from an Australian scholar named Patrick Wolfe, who really helped to clarify this term for us, you know, where we say settler colonialism is about the elimination of the native population in order to get the land and then replace the native people. So it's fundamentally a genocidal project, and it sets up structures. So the system of domination of one group over another is a system that happens without the consent of the indigenous population. It's fundamentally violent, it's genocidal, because its goal is to eliminate native populations. And this is the common thread that people, indigenous people in settler countries like the US and Canada, and arguably South America, but especially Australia, New Zealand, and other places in the South Pacific, some of the Pacific Islands. There are other places that are beginning to use this term settler colonialism as well. But this is the foundation of how we understand our historical experience and our relationship to this government that has imposed itself, called the United States. And so in all of these processes and this history, what's happened is that indigenous people, in order to justify this very violent taking of the land, the goal was to you know, frame indigenous peoples as inferior, right? The barbaric savages. They're barbarians and savages because they're not Christians. And so, this, of course, all this begins with the Catholic Church in the 15th century. But the logic of all of that colonization gets carried forth into the new American government, and then becomes the foundation of the entire legal structure that maintains what is today still a paternalistic and hegemonic relationship between the U.S. and Native American nations. And so it's systemic and structural, this inferiorizing of Native people. And I always like to show this this image, because it's so poignantly makes visual all of these representations, about Europeans who see themselves, white Europeans who see themselves as having a superior genius. And this, yes, that's the language that was used in Supreme Court decisions beginning in 1823 to describe themselves in relationship to Native people. So, Native or, white Europeans have they're more intelligent, they have better technology, they have better religion. And so this justifies all this, their westward expansion and, pushing the Native people off. Okay, so let's getting down to a few facts to help us frame our conversation. As Nora Lynn said 576 federally recognized tribes. I thought it was 574, but obviously it's growing, and sometimes it can be hard to keep track of. Based on the U.S. Census, there was of 2020. There were 9.7 million American Indian people. This is based on self-identification, which has its issues, but still, that's it is what it is. But this means people who identify either alone in racially, just American Indian, or in combination with another race. Of course, the census is all about racializing people and counting people based on these racial categories. So it's roughly 2.9, almost 3% of the total population. And in between censuses, between the 2010 and 2020 census, the American Indian Alaska Native alone population, those that did not characterize themselves as racially mixed, grew by 27.1%. And in combination with other races, those who, checked the box that they are American Indian and some other race, grew by 160% since 2010. So our numbers are rebounding, and there's probably a lot of things to talk about that, but I don't want to get too far into that. This image here, I just found that shows the fastest growing American Indian Alaska Native populations. And you can see, it just shows you here, they're all very rural places in the West, in Nevada and Arizona, Utah, Arizona, but also Maryland. Isn't that interesting? Oklahoma and Washington. Okay, so some other things that most people might know is, when we talk about some of the disparities of American Indian populations in these three categories that I chose to focus on, are health, education, and wealth. This has always been the case. Native people have always had the worst health, the worst health indicators of any other ethnic group or racial group in the US. That's still the case. Native people, have the highest rates of diabetes and other related illnesses around, especially around nutritionally related diseases, but also substance abuse problems. Life expectancy among American Indian Alaska Native people is nearly 6 years less than any other race or ethnic group in the US. 72.4 years of age versus 77.8 for the general population. In terms of education, 65% of American Indian Alaska Native people earn a high school diploma compared to 75.2% of the US population. 25% of our populations over the age of 25 had an associate or higher degree compared to 42% of all other groups over the age of 25. Okay, in terms of wealth and poverty, Native people have always been at the bottom of the heap. In 2018, this one study showed that Native people, and this is pretty consistent across the board, Native people still have the highest poverty rates among all minority groups, where the national poverty rate for American Indians was at 25.4%, while for African American populations was at 20.8%. And so I like to point out that all of these disparities can be traced back to the history of genocide and land dispossession. Okay, so when we talk about who is an American Indian or even Alaska Native, but we're going to just kind of abbreviate it to American Indian at this point. It's a person that's enrolled in a federally recognized tribe or Alaska Native village, or registered descendants of federally recognized tribes. These are legal distinctions. A registered descendant of a federally recognized tribe or a state recognized or Alaska Native village. So these kinds of documents refer to, tribal enrollment and certificate degrees of Indian blood. Tribal membership is an exercise of tribal sovereignty, and it's based on tribal criteria. So in other words, federal law has affirmed that tribes have the authority to determine who their members or /citizens are or descendants. And we like to say that American Indian is, being American Indian is a responsibility, and it's determined by a very complex combination of lineage, of descending, literally descending, lineal descent, or citizenship, and kinship ties to and cultural involvement. But we're the only people, the only ethnicity of people who has to prove who they are in all these various different ways. Okay, so this leads to to the topic at hand. Like, let's talk about what is equity. And in this work, of course, there's often a lot of confusion between the terms equity and equality. And we can say that equality, in this concept of equality, is that everyone gets the same resources and treatment regardless of circumstances, whereas equity refers to the gaining of resources or treatment which is commensurate with the circumstances. And this is what this image really shows you. So this image here on the left is equality. So everybody's got, the equality of this stool that boosts them up to reach for this resource here on the tree. And you see that this person, who's the shortest, doesn't have an equal advantage. So this is really about advantage here. Whereas here, this person has been given a greater advantage because they're starting out from a disadvantaged point. And so there's access, there's an equal access to these resources of, on this little colorful tree here. So it recognizes that groups and individuals have these varying experiences and circumstances. And so this leads to a talk about why for American Indians, the concept of equality is really misleading. We live in the US with the civil rights movement brought us this language of equality, and, because of the varying circumstances of different peoples and of course the historic, mistreatment and abuse of various populations, but So, but American Indians, because the concept of equality is problematic compared to all other populations. And the reason is that American